All right, let's just jump right in. Today, we're stepping into a genuinely terrifying and incredibly dark corner of internet lore. We're looking at a story that completely blurs the line between a total psychological breakdown and straight-up supernatural horror. It's a deep dive into the mind of a girl who lost absolutely everything, and the absolute nightmare of an entity that moved in to take its place. So, you might want to grab a seat, get comfortable, and honestly, maybe leave the lights on for this one. Because today, in this explainer, we are dissecting the origin of a modern digital monster. Let's get started. I want you to picture this for a second. Imagine waking up. Your life is already just this miserable tapestry of abuse and sadness, only to hear a voice right inside your own head saying, "Don't you remember, Alice? I am your best friend. I am Zero. We're best friends forever." It's not some random new voice either. It's a voice from your childhood, one you were so sure you had locked away forever. And that right there establishes the core terror of this whole story. It's the ultimate violation of privacy, you know? It's that sinking, terrifying realization that you are literally no longer alone in your own mind. And worse, the thing sharing your skull has absolutely no intention of ever leaving. Now, before we rewind and uncover exactly how she was created, we really need to look at what she ultimately becomes. Because the entity known as Zero, she is a ruthless, completely unstoppable force. She operates in a world that is literally drained of all its color, and she constantly drags this heavy, blood-stained sledgehammer behind her. She's a creature of pure, isolated violence. But the craziest part is, she didn't crawl out of some cursed videotape or a haunted graveyard. No, she was born directly from the fractured, broken mind of a sweet, innocent little girl. It's really wild when you look at the tragic duality of this character. On one hand, you have Alice Marie Jackson. She was just a shy, highly intelligent kid with caramel hair and green eyes. She literally just wanted to fit in, but she was constantly, mercilessly bullied. And then, on the absolute flip side, you have Zero. Zero is a violent, colorless entity. She's defined by bleached white skin, violently stitched cheeks, and this fiercely possessive nature. They physically share the exact same body, but they are complete and total opposites. So the big question is, how on earth did Alice become a Zero? Well, to understand that, we have to walk through the timeline of her suffering. Alice's life was basically a masterclass in compounding psychological trauma. As a deeply, deeply lonely child, she actually created a series of imaginary friends just to protect herself. She even numbered them to keep track. Number 0 was the very first one, created specifically to shield Alice from the kids bullying her. But then, when Alice was just 7 years old, unthinkable tragedy struck. Both of her parents were killed in a horrific accident right in front of her. After that, she was forced into the care of this abusive, alcoholic neighbor named Mr. Rogers. And by the time she had high school, she was enduring severe daily physical beatings from her own classmates. It was, unfortunately, the perfect tragic breeding ground for something incredibly dark to take root in her mind. The absolute defining moment of Alice's entire life was that car crash. According to the lore, 7-year-old Alice felt this strange, totally inexplicable compulsion to just step out into the middle of the road. Out of nowhere, a massive white truck came barreling toward her, swerved wildly to avoid hitting her, and crashed straight down a hill, instantly bursting into flames. Alice just stood there, completely paralyzed, watching as the blinding red flames consumed her mother, while her father bled out in the wreckage. The sheer visceral sensory details of that specific day, especially the piercing red of the fire and the deep crimson of the blood, became permanently burned into her psyche. But here is the deeply disturbing twist that completely changes how we look at this story. Zero eventually confesses something horrifying to Alice. Zero admits that she was actually the one who planted that urge in Alice's mind to step into the road. Basically, Zero caused the crash. And why? Because she felt Alice's parents were keeping them apart. They were preventing Zero from doing her quote-unquote job of protecting Alice. I mean, that is just a malevolent, wildly toxic level of possessiveness. Zero didn't just want to protect Alice, she wanted to isolate her from the entire world. As you might guess, this toxic isolation eventually builds into a completely unbearable tension. By high school, Alice starts actually losing time. During one particularly bad bullying incident, she completely blacks out. When she finally comes to, she realizes she has brutally beaten 2 boys, we're talking breaking bones and causing severe internal injuries, with absolutely zero memory of doing it. And then the physical manifestations start happening. She goes back to her desk at school only to find these weird red circles drawn all over her work. Finally, the breaking point. She comes home to find her abusive guardian, Mr. Rogers, completely decapitated. His severed head is just sitting in her bedroom right next to a massive, bloody sledgehammer. At this point, Alice is entirely losing control of her own body. Fleeing in a total panic, Alice trips, hits her head hard, and loses consciousness. But when she wakes up, she isn't in her house anymore. She finds herself in this pitch-black room filled with hundreds of mirrors just staring at her own reflection. Except it's not her reflection, it's Zero. This mirror room essentially acts as a terrifying psychological cage. Zero calmly explains that she has latched onto Alice's consciousness to protect her, and because Alice ignored her for all those years, Zero has finally grown strong enough to take the wheel for good. Hearing this, Alice flies into this uncontrollable, frantic rage. She starts smashing the glass mirrors with her bare fists as hard and as fast as she can. But the scariest part? She feels absolutely no physical pain. The takeover is practically complete. Okay, fair warning, the story gets incredibly gruesome here. When Alice finally breaks that very last mirror, she wakes up back in her own bathroom, but her physical body has been forever changed. Her skin and her hair have been somehow bleached a blinding, stark white, and these deep, pitch-black circles are ringing her eyes. But Zero? She isn't finished yet. Looking into the bathroom mirror, Zero decides she literally wants to look like a skeleton. So she takes a pair of sharp scissors, slices her own cheeks open into this wide, horrifying smile, and actually sews the flesh together with a needle and thread. And then, because the color red constantly reminds her of the trauma of that car crash, she dips her fingers in pure bleach and pours it directly into her own eyes. When the agonizing burning finally stops, and her vision slowly returns, the entire world is completely devoid of color. Zero now sees everything exclusively in stark black, blinding white, and this washed-out faded gray. The gruesome transformation from the innocent, bullied Alice into the horrific, skeletal Zero is totally finished. She reaches down, picks up the heavy sledgehammer, completely ready to step out into the world and unleash chaos. And right at that exact moment, the telephone rings. On the other end of the line is Anne. Now, Anne is Alice's one and only remaining true friend. Zero answers, perfectly mimicking Alice's normal voice, and casually agrees to come over. When Anne opens her front door, she is understandably terrified by the white, stitched-up monster standing on her porch. Zero easily overpowers her, pins her to the floor, and delivers this absolutely chilling line. Alice is long gone. As for why, well, you can't have Zero with one left. And then she brutally smashes Anne's skull in with the sledgehammer. In a final, incredibly morbid act, Zero actually removes Anne's bones to construct a skeleton on the floor, using the black blood she sees to draw a giant zero right where the shattered skull used to be. She grabs a black and white scarf that Anne had actually meant as a gift for Alice and just vanishes into the woods. Okay, part 2, dissecting the legend, supernatural entity or psychological break. Okay, let's take a deep breath. That narrative is undeniably terrifying, right? It's basically a masterclass in body horror and psychological dread. But let's step back from the sledgehammers for a minute and put our investigator hats on. The source material points us directly to a very specific concept from paranormal theory, the tulpa. Now, what is a tulpa? It's essentially an entity that is willed into literal existence. It starts off as just a thought, maybe an imaginary friend or a shared concept. But through intense mental focus, or extreme spiritual discipline, or even sheer collective belief, that thought actually gathers mass. It gains real energy. Eventually, the theory goes, it crosses the threshold from pure imagination right into physical reality. Which brings us to the ultimate question at the very heart of this explainer. What exactly is Zero? Is she simply a tragic, albeit extreme case of dissociative identity disorder? Just a fractured alternate personality created by Alice's fragile mind to cope with insurmountable trauma and years of abuse? Or, as a lot of theorists actually suggest, did Alice's incredibly intense belief in her imaginary protector actually birth a tulpa, a literal, supernatural parasite that fed on her immense trauma until it was strong enough to completely consume her soul? When you really dig into the evidence from the lore, it's pretty clear why so many fans lean heavily toward the paranormal theory. I mean, there are specific details that definitely point way beyond mere psychology. For instance, think about the red circles drawn on Alice's schoolwork. They appeared on her desk while Alice was physically sitting in the nurse's office. How on earth could a split personality draw on a desk when the physical body isn't even in the same room? Then you have her complete, totally unnatural immunity to physical pain during the mirror room sequence and the self-mutilation. And maybe the biggest clue, Zero possessed independent, specific knowledge of the car crash dynamics that Alice herself literally didn't consciously know. These clues strongly suggest that an entirely external entity took control. But, we can also look at this entire thing from a completely different angle. Let's contrast the in-universe story, this terrifying tale of a girl possessed by her own imaginary friend, with the real-world academic perspective of how these internet stories actually function. Because at the end of the day, characters like Zero don't just exist in a vacuum. They exist online. They are shared, debated, and actively shaped by thousands of people. Actually, research from Lake Forest College provides some incredible insight into this. Academics argue that internet horror stories, often called creepypastas, are really just modern digital folklore. Think about it. For millennia, human beings have created monsters lurking in the shadows to act as conduits for our shared cultural fears. Today, the internet just accelerates that process. These stories rely entirely on collaborative audience participation to survive and evolve, working exactly like traditional oral folklore. They express our deep, collective anxieties about things like isolation, severe mental illness, and the terrifying loss of control. And in some incredibly tragic real-world cases, like the infamous Slender Man stabbings, the sheer volume of collective belief can actually dangerously blur the lines between fiction and reality, especially for really vulnerable minds. And that brings us to a final, deeply unsettling thought I want to leave you with today. If the academic theory is actually right, and monsters like Zero are simply modern folklore kept alive by our collective attention, and if the paranormal theory is also right, and a tulpa is a literal entity brought into reality by sheer collective belief and focus, then what exactly are we doing right now? By dissecting this legend, by focusing all of our attention on her, and by retelling Alice's tragedy today, are we just feeding Zero? Are we making her stronger? Just think about that the next time you happen to catch your own reflection in a dark mirror. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Stay safe out there, and as always, keep learning.